It is our custom to take a few minutes the first Sunday of each month to highlight one of the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism. Contrary to our speaker's suggestion that we highlight principle number 4, I was drawn instead to the 7th principle. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote respect for the interdependent web of existence, of all existence of which we are a part. When I learned about today's topic, is belief in God rational, it reminded me of a message presented here several years ago by the Reverend Gwen Schultz. What can you say when you can't say God? In her talk, Gwen suggested that when you remove the word God and all of its trappings and baggage that accompany it, there is still a presence, the ineffable expansive mystery, a love that encompasses all, she explained. And I wonder, does our respect for the interdependent web of life include a notion of wonder, of awe, a sense of the sacred? The Reverend Forrest Gilmore writes that our 7th principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence, is a glorious statement. Yet we make a profound mistake when we limit it merely to an environmental idea. It is so much more. Our 7th principle may be our Unitarian Universalist way of coming to fully embrace something greater than ourselves, the interdependent web, expressed as the spirit of life, the ground of all being, the oneness of all existence, the community forming power, the process of life, the creative force, nature, never spent. Even God can help us develop that social understanding of ourselves that we and our culture so desperately need. And I invite you now to each take a moment to set aside any thoughts, concerns, keeping you from being fully present to hear the message prepared for today. So please, let's take a moment in silent contemplation. I now present Terry.
Good morning.
Good morning.
A little haiku here from my friend Jack. A supreme being. Is the belief rational? Even God wonders. It says here, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Hank, for the introduction and for filling in for Susan. Well, thank you, Joan, for your lovely music. I will miss you. Come back soon to visit. And thank you to the fellowship for the opportunity to speak today. It's always an honor and a privilege. Now, originally, we're going to do a talk back, but the talk backs were always preceded in the past by coffee and treats. But we don't do the treats anymore. But Pam bought this the other day. It's, oh my God, brownies. And we won't be serving them today. But the first time back when we have treats after the service someday, she will make these. She has until July 6th of 1922. So, a Catholic priest, a Pentecostal preacher, and a Jewish rabbi meet at Al Johnson's for breakfast every Monday morning to talk shop. One Monday, the priest makes an argument that preaching to people isn't all that hard. The real challenge would be to preach to and to convert a bear. One thing led to another, and they decided to do an experiment. They would each go their own way, find a bear, preach to it, and attempt to convert it. The next Monday, they would reconvene at Al Johnson's to relate their experiences. The 7 days were up, and they got back together, but this time at the Door County Medical Center. Father Flannery, the Catholic priest, had his arm in a sling, was on crutches, and had a number of bandages. Well, he said, I went into the Ephraim swamp to find a bear, and when I found him, I began to read to him from the catechism. That bear wanted nothing to do with it, and he slapped me around pretty good. So I grabbed my holy water, sprinkled him, and Mary, Mother of God, he was converted and became as gentle as a lamb. The bishop is coming next week to give him First Communion and confirmation. Reverend Billy Bob, the Pentecostal preacher, spoke next. He was in a wheelchair with an arm and a leg in a cast. In his best fire and brimstone oratory, he exclaimed, well, my brothers, you know that Pentecostals don't just sprinkle. I went into Peninsula Park and found me a bear. And then I began to read from God's holy word, and that bear wanted nothing to do with me. So I took hold of him and we began to wrestle, and we wrestled all the way down to Nicolay Bay. And then I did a full immersion, baptizing his hairy soul. Just like that, he became as gentle as a lamb. We spent the rest of the day praying and praising the Lord. Father Flannery and Reverend Billy Bob looked down at their friend, the rabbi, who was in a hospital bed in a full body cast and in traction. Well, the rabbi said in a weak voice, looking back on it now, I probably should have led with something other than circumcision. This joke goes to the heart of what I want to talk about today. Not whether practicing religious rituals is a prerequisite for salvation, but whether religious belief in general and belief in God in particular is rational. Spoiler alert, it depends. I know, as Unitarians, you are very disappointed with that answer because I know how much you love certainty. That said, let me get to the details, and I will see if you might look at it differently by the end of the message. First, some background and philosophical history. Talk about rational belief in God usually begins with the question of whether God exists. Why? Because if it could be proven that God exists, then of course it would be rational to believe it. But no convincing proofs for God's existence have been forthcoming in Western philosophy. Debate about the problem reached the point where philosophers argued that it can even be proven that we cannot prove that God exists. For example, Bertrand Russell. Others argued that the problem is not even worth talking about because talk about God is meaningless. For example, the logical positivists. Time magazine even ran a cover in the late 1960s proclaiming that God is dead. Despite these claims, the problem of whether belief in God is rational is important because the problem is not one of just proving God's existence or demonstrating that the concept of God is meaningful. The problem of rational belief in God is broader and deeper. It involves the question of whether God is possible, i.e., it raises the question whether the concept of God is consistent, which was the question Leibniz asked back in the 17th century, leading to the development of what is known as theodicy. It involves the question of whether God is within the realm of human understanding, i.e., whether human concepts apply to God, which was Kant's concern in the 18th century, leading to the important view that there are things that are beyond human comprehension. And it involves the question of whether there is justification for belief in God, even if we cannot prove that God exists, which has been the lifelong focus of the Christian apologist Alvin Plantinga in the 20th and 21st centuries. The questions of the possibility of God, whether human understanding of God is possible, and whether there is any possible justification for belief in God, go to the heart of the question of the rationality of belief in God. And we shall now go there as well, concentrating on the issue of justification. Contrary to local legend, God is not from Door County. However, last Sunday, I found evidence that he may be visiting in Ephraim. Here is a license plate that I saw there last week. Now, I don't know if you can see it, it says God's County. I note that it's a very old Ford and that the license plate has been expired. Okay. While we really don't know where God is from, we do know that he came into existence, philosophical existence that is, through three famous arguments. As indicated, the idea was that if one could get a proof that God existed, one would have grounds for rational belief in God. The three arguments are well known to all, so please excuse the brief review. First, the cosmological argument, the before-the-fact first cause argument. Aristotle was the earliest proponent in the 4th century before the Common Era, arguing for an unmoved mover, i.e. something responsible for motion in the universe. Second, the teleological argument, the after-the-fact argument from design. Cicero being the principal proponent in the 2nd century of the Common Era, arguing that the universe appears to be designed, so something had to be responsible for the design. And third, my favorite, the ontological argument, the because of the fact argument from the definition of God. St. Anselm, being the originator in the 11th century, arguing, how could the being in whom no greater can be conceived not exist? Because if it didn't, it would then be possible to conceive of a greater being, namely one just like it, but which did exist. This was and still is very heady stuff, coming from the monk who was soon to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. These three arguments for God's existence and their many variants over many centuries have all failed for one reason or another. Explaining why will be the topic of my message next Sunday. At the same time, all of the arguments against the existence of God have failed as well. The most famous of these being the argument from evil. If God is omnibenevolent, i.e. all good, why then is there evil in the world? Which was essentially Job's question in the Old Testament 4,000 years ago, long before any of the arguments for God just noted. And the free will determinism argument, if God is omniscient, i.e. all-knowing, then God knows what I'm going to do next, so how then can I be free? And as Kant significantly added, how then can I be held morally responsible for my actions? I shall explain why that is so next Sunday as well. Long and short of it, philosophers have rehashed and redeveloped the pro and con arguments for the existence of God for centuries. God's existence is, by all accounts, the most discussed problem in Western philosophy, with more books and journal articles written about it than any other problem. But progress has not been forthcoming. This suggests that the question needs to be recast. Despite the failure to either prove or disprove whether God exists, might it still be rational to believe it? If so, why? And if not, why not? We shall now explore these questions. Alvin Plantinga was one of my graduate school professors, and he argued in the 1960s in his famous book, God and Other Minds. Here is a signed copy, one of few, both signed and copies. He's a great teacher. He argued that belief in God is like belief in other minds. Plantinga's argument was that if we believe in other minds, which we all do, i.e. if we believe that those other than us are sentient beings, even if we cannot prove it, and in fact, as Plantinga convincingly showed we cannot prove it, then the kinds of reasons we have for belief in God and belief in other minds are of a piece with the kinds of reasons we have for belief in God. Therefore, we should also believe in God because we believe in other minds. Plantinga's analogical argument was an important contribution to the discussion of rational belief in God, but one not without problems. It opened the door for rational belief in anything. In short, the argument proved too much. Just as Gounod's argument against Anselm's original ontological argument way back in the year 1077 showed that Anselm's argument proved too much. Let me explain because the point is important. Gounod argued that if Anselm had a proof that the perfect being existed, i.e. the being in whom no greater can be conceived, then he also had a proof that anything than which no greater can be conceived must also exist. Ganilo's example was the perfect island. No, it wasn't Washington Island. It's interesting to note that Leibniz picked up on this perfection idea 600 years later, arguing that everything perfect must exist if God exists, and thus this must be the best of all possible worlds. The idea that this is the best of all possible worlds was, of course, what Voltaire parodied, marking Leibniz in his famous novellas Candide and Zadig. But back to Plantinga's argument. As indicated, the problem with arguing from belief in other minds to belief in God, and thus to be the rationality of believing the latter, is that we can then argue for the rationality of believing in anything using the same analogical argument. Santa Claus comes immediately to mind. While Plantinga denies that his argument lets Santa Claus into the manger, his reasons why are too complex to go into here today. But he did recognize that he needed something stronger than the other mind's analogical argument to justify rational belief in God. Plantinga delivered on that in his subsequent work, Warranted Christian Belief, where he made a different case for rational belief in God. And he did so not by arguing that God exists, but by arguing that if God exists, which would then mean that it was true, there would have to be warrant for the belief, i.e. something that made the belief true. Clever, but what warrant? Enter the Christian apologist. Plantinga argued that warrant for belief in God comes from sensus divinitatis, our sense of the divine. The concept had its roots in the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, but the term was coined by John Calvin. I note that Plantinga is a lifelong Calvinist. He, his father, and two of his brothers all taught philosophy or theology at Calvin College. But what is the basis of sensus divinitatis? Calvin identified it as an ability to discover God that precedes reason through a sense implanted in us, not by God, but by nature. Plantinga describes it as a natural human tendency, a disposition. The idea of God is not innate, rather the sense of the divine is like memory and perception. It serves to form and mold our beliefs. Our utilization of the capacity makes us think about God, just like our utilization of perception and memory make us think about the world. And when we do, we find truth. Okay, enough exegesis of sensus divinitatis before I convert you all to Calvinism. While an important effort on Plantinga's part, because of the novel approach of arguing that we don't need a proof of God's existence, just a basis for the belief, if it were true, in order to demonstrate its rationality, nonetheless, the argument has problems. What if I have sensus divinitatis of a different divine being, say Allah or Buddha? Or is that not possible? And if not, why not? Or what if I have sensus of a being that turns out to be mythical? That seems quite possible. Santa Claus again comes to mind. But surely that would not be warrant for believing it. A more telling criticism, however, is that Plantinga's argument is circular. If my belief in God is warranted because of the sense of the divine implanted in me by nature, then the theory that says the implanted sense of the divine delivers knowledge is a theory that itself requires warrant. In short, Plantinga takes as his model for warranted belief justifying the basis of the belief, but that methodology itself requires justification. Moreover, there is a damning corollary of the sensus divinitatis theory, just in case you were still thinking about converting to Calvinism. What about people who don't have sensus divinitatis? Or perhaps better, what about those of us whose sense of the divine is not actualized? Plantinga argues, as did Calvin, that failure of sensus divinitatis in any individual is because you have sinned. Plantinga calls it the noetic effect of sin, sin having muddled your thoughts about God. This is clearly self-serving on the part of both Calvin and Plantinga, and close to a conspiracy theory, particularly given Calvinist views about original sin and depravity. But it does at least explain why there are Unitarians. It's time to move on. We need a new approach to the problem of rational belief. We need to move away from trying to justify beliefs in order to demonstrate their rationality. We need a non-justificationist approach to the problem. What would it mean to say that a belief is rational from such a perspective? Well, it depends upon what the meaning of rational is, to quote a famous line from Bill Clinton. We need a theory. We need a theory of rational belief that gets us beyond the idea that warrant and justification are necessary conditions of rationality. We need a theory that looks in the opposite direction. I'm not the first to conceive of such an idea, but as William James once said, the next best thing to a new idea is a good old one. Here then is a non-justificationist theory of rational belief. I talked about it at the UU 9 years ago, as I'm sure you all recall. So if you do, you can just nod off at this point. And if you don't, well, you can do the same. A belief is rational if it meets three conditions. First, the in principle condition. The belief can be held open to criticism. That is, it is a belief that can be tested, at least in principle, not verified or justified, but tested. There are many beliefs that do not meet this standard. For example, a belief that the universe and everything in it doubles in size overnight and its volumes quadruple unbeknownst to us is an example of an untestable belief, because any testing involving it will be such that the tools of measurement will themselves have doubled or quadrupled in size overnight. Or the belief that the universe came into existence 2 minutes ago, with everything in place as it is, with all the fossils, all of our beliefs, all of our memories, everyone here now at the UU, et cetera, is another such belief. Neither it nor the doubling hypothesis are open to criticism. They cannot be held open to criticism because they cannot be tested. There's no way to show that they are mistaken, even though we believe that they obviously are. This is, by the way, a problem with all conspiracy theories. They are made untestable on purpose. Because the two beliefs identified cannot be tested, they are not worthy of further consideration. Discussion of them will get us nowhere, even if they were true. This is an interesting problem that we can pursue in the talkback if you wish, because the theory of rational belief being proposed entails that even things that are true may not be rational to believe. Second, the in practice condition. The belief not only can be held open to criticism, but is held open to criticism by its proponents. This condition represents what I call the institutional standard of rational belief. If you cannot give up belief in something, if without belief in it you cannot be what you claim to be, then your belief is not held rationally, whether or not it is true. This is the problem with all authoritarian theories, particularly those of traditional religion and the fundamental beliefs at their core. Within traditional Christian religions, you cannot give up the belief that Christ is God and still be a Christian, because that's what it means to be a Christian. Thus, given the theory of rational belief being proposed, the fundamental belief of traditional Christianity, i.e. the belief that Christ is God, is an irrational belief. This is not blasphemy. The belief is irrational not because it is false. It might even be true. It is irrational because of the way the belief is held. It is not and cannot be challenged by those who believe it. The belief is non-negotiable. Its denial is off the table. This is why so many arguments about religious belief get us nowhere. One of the keys to understanding the theory of rational belief being proposed is that it is not truth that is important for rational belief, but open-mindedness. Third, the in theory condition. The belief must have withstood all reasonable criticism. This condition means that up until now, all philosophical, scientific, and logical criticism of the belief have been met. As Nietzsche said, the truth is what is held to be irrefutable, but has not yet been refuted. The point is, withstanding criticism, even if the belief in question is mistaken, is a reasonable standard until the belief in question is refuted. Thus, even if a belief is false, if it is testable, held open to criticism by its proponents, and has withstood all reasonable criticism, it is rational to believe it. So it can be rational to believe things that are false, and it can be irrational to believe things that are true. Hey, I said the problem was broad and deep. The theory of rational belief just proposed is known as critical rationalism. It has its roots in ancient Greek philosophy in the Socratic dialectic. It also had proponents among 19th century American pragmatist Charles Sanders Peirce and John Dewey in particular. Its modern and most developed version is attributable to the 20th century philosopher Karl Popper and his student William Warren Bartley III. It is a very powerful theory. Unlike other theories of rational belief, it meets its own standards. It can be and is held open to criticism by its proponents, and it has met all serious challenges to date. In fact, to criticize it is to practice it. To be rational is to be critical. It is to hold all of your beliefs open to criticism all the time. It is to meet those challenges through rational counter-argument. Of course, in order to fully develop the theory, we need standards for an acceptance of what counts as rational criticism. Developing those standards and getting that consent will, of course, require a few more UU Sundays. An important point already noted is that the theory of critical rationalism allows beliefs that are false to be held rationally. But that's just the point. Because any theory might be false, including the theory that any theory might be false, which would of course then make some theory true, we must hold all of our beliefs open to criticism. Even our observation statements and our crucial tests must be held open to criticism. We must welcome criticism and redevelop our theories to meet the challenges of that criticism. We must do so not by insulating our theories to eliminate or explain away anomalous cases, but by improving our theories in ways that take us beyond where we are today, improving our explanations and thus making progress. Only this will get us closer to the truth. Getting new and better criticisms, new and better theories, and new and better problems are at the heart of what it means to be rational. Let me quote from my late dear friend Rick Warsh, former Lawrence University president, to illustrate the point. In his 1993 matriculation address, Rick argued, and I quote, "My beliefs say that the world was created in 6 days may be a deeply felt conviction, but to the extent that I do not admit the possibility of its error, then I cannot keep that idea in play for inquiry. Further, science has convincingly demonstrated that the idea as knowledge doesn't count. Consequently, it has no place in the public debate about ideas regarding the origin of the universe or a species on two grounds. First, I refuse to acknowledge that it might be wrong, and second, it has failed to meet the test of withstanding attempts to debunk it," unquote. So to conclude, why is the theory of critical rationalism progress on the problem of whether belief in God is rational, the problem with which this essay began? First, it moves us away from justification as the path to a solution, because justification has failed as a method to demonstrate that belief in God is rational. Second, it allows that belief in God can be rational even if the belief is false, if those who believe it remain open to and can meet rational criticism of it. I think this resets the table for the next Last Supper, possibly even allowing Unitarians a seat. By adopting a critical approach, we can go forward on common ground. We can act on our beliefs rationally until such time as they are shown to be mistaken. And if and when they are, we can then change course, making progress toward the truth. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak. I hope you found the message informative. I look forward to the talk back where I will explain why belief in Santa Claus is rational.
Thank you, Terry. And again, as he has already indicated, there is going to be a talk back following the postlude. We'll take a few moments to regroup those that are going to leave. Obviously, you're going to be leaving. Some of you may wish to socialize. You can do that in the Memorial Garden or elsewhere. But I hope most of you are sufficiently intrigued by what Terry had to say that you might come back and join us for about 15 minutes of questions and answers. Closing words by Robert Doss. For all those who see God, may God go with you. For all those who embrace life, may life return the affection. For all those who seek the right path, may you find the courage to take it, step by step.
At this point, most of you know that Pat and I are going to be moving to a retirement community down in Milwaukee late this fall. I just wanted to take this moment this morning to thank all of you who are members of this congregation for the way in which you welcomed me 5 years ago, so freely, so happily, putting me into a program committee, a covenant group, dinners for, what do they call it? Circle dinners, a choir, and occasionally a book club. I also want to take this moment to especially thank Carol Sober and Cindy Steele for crossing their fingers and allowing me to play this piano, this treasure that you all have. The song I've chosen this morning for the postlude is called Love Changes Everything. It is from a musical by Andrew Lloyd Webber, Aspects of Love. I chose it because I think that everybody here believes that love does change everything. And as the final words of the song say, love changes everything and nothing else can ever, ever be the same. So be it.